Hello and welcome to another weather update. Tonight we're going to be discussing the high risk that is in parts of Oklahoma and into southern Kansas. So as of the latest 20Z update on Monday, May the 6th, we do have a high risk into parts of central to northern Oklahoma and then into parts of southern Kansas there. Around that is a moderate risk from about central Kansas, central and eastern Kansas all the way into about southern Oklahoma and then touching barely at the border of Texas right there. And then around that moderate risk is an enhanced risk from about southeastern Nebraska and then into southwestern Iowa all the way down into far northern Texas. And then we also have a slight risk around that all the way into about northwestern South Dakota, far east into about central and southern Iowa and into western Illinois, then down south all the way into northern Texas. And then we also do have a marginal risk all the way from about far southeastern Montana all the way into about western South Carolina and far western North Carolina all the way down into about south just there. We do have a 30% risk of tornadoes into Oklahoma and then into southern Kansas. Around that is a 15% risk, and then around that is a 10% all the way from about southern Nebraska all the way down into northern Texas. Around that is a 5% all the way from about eastern Nebraska all the way into Iowa, all the way south into northern Texas, and then a 2% all the way from about southeastern Montana all the way down into central Texas. And then we also do have a 2% into far western North Carolina, northern Georgia, northern Alabama, and central and eastern parts of eastern Tennessee. But we do have a hatch risk that includes parts or most of the 10% risk. It includes all of the 30% and all of the 15% risk. And this means that there's a 10% or greater probability of EF2 to EF5 tornadoes within 25 miles of a point in this hatched risk right here. And then looking at our wind risk, we do have a 5% risk for damaging winds, and that is into northeastern Oklahoma and then into southeastern Kansas. And then we also have a 30% around that from about far northern Texas, and then into about most of the eastern half of Oklahoma, into eastern Kansas and Nebraska, and then into far western Missouri, and then into northwestern Arkansas. And then we also do have a hatch risk that includes all of the 45% risk and then into parts most of the 30% risk there, and then even into a little bit of that 15% risk. But we do have a 15% risk of damaging winds all the way from about northwestern South Dakota all the way down into northern Texas and east into parts of Missouri. And then we have a 5% around that all the way from about southeast Montana into parts of Texas all the way east into Tennessee, northern Mississippi, northern Alabama, northern Georgia, western South Carolina, and western North Carolina there. With our hail risk, we do have a 45% risk of large hail, and we have this 45 here all the way from about parts of west central Oklahoma into southern Kansas, and then into we have our 30% risk from about southern Nebraska all the way into parts of far northern Texas. And then with our 15% risk from about northwestern South Dakota all the way into parts of northern Texas, and a 5% around that from about southeastern Montana all the way down into parts of Texas there. We also do have a hatch risk around parts of the 15% risk area, all of the 30% risk area, and all of the 45% risk area. And this means a 10% or greater probability of 2-inch diameter hail or larger within 25 miles of a point in here. And then we have another 5% risk for hail in parts of western South Carolina, far western North Carolina, and then into parts of central Tennessee into far northeastern Mississippi, northern Alabama, and into northern Georgia right there. Quickly looking at tomorrow's severe weather threat, we do have a severe weather risk in parts of the Ohio Valley, and then for Wednesday on the 8th, we do have an enhanced risk in parts of the Ohio Valley and parts of the Midwest, and then into parts of the Mid-South there. And on our data for day 4 to 8 range, we do have another 15% to 15% risk areas, one into Texas and then one into parts of the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast states. Before we go any farther into the video, I will not be talking about tomorrow's severe weather threat and the following days because I'm just trying to get this video as quickly as I can. But first, let's start looking at the 20Z HRRR. We may change this to the 21Z. It's not fully out yet, but we'll stick with the 20Z HRRR from today. So we already have numerous storms across parts of Nebraska and Kansas, and then the 20Z HRRR wants to show storms already starting to form over the next just a couple of hours. Major storms into Oklahoma, Kansas, and then into Nebraska. Definitely a damaging wind risk, very large hail risk with this, and that tornado risk. And the tornado risk will be greater later into this evening, into tonight. But looking on the 20Z HRRR, still showing that very long line all the way from Oklahoma, even into parts of South Dakota right there. And then really with any of these storms, they'll have that potential for those damaging winds, very large hail, and tornadoes. And you're going to have to watch all of these storms very closely over the next couple of hours because they're going to intensify rapidly, just generally over all of these areas here into Oklahoma, Kansas, and into Nebraska and South Dakota. And then that shows all these storms, and we have this long line of storms in clusters moving throughout Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska into Iowa, even into western Missouri right there. And this will be later this evening into tonight, and then still going forward. This is a very long line. This will definitely be a damaging wind producer, and you still have some kind of isolated cells trying to form in Oklahoma showing up on the 20Z HRRR, and this will be late tonight, and then going into very early tomorrow. You have this long line of storms all the way from pretty much Iowa and then all the way down into Oklahoma. They're showing up very late tonight into early tomorrow on Tuesday. Looking at our surface temperatures on the 20Z HRRR, you have plenty of surface heating with your storms that are ongoing right now. We'll take a look at those on radar at towards the end of the video, but still you have temps well into the 70s, and then you can tell where those temperatures fall off and lower where those storms are forming, showing up on the HRRR. But you'll have temperatures definitely into at least the upper 60s in Iowa, into the 70s, and then into Missouri into the 70s, and then still definitely into northern Texas, well into the 80s and possibly 90s, throughout Oklahoma, well into the 70s and lower to mid 80s, and then into Kansas, into the mid and upper 60s to mid 70s, and then even into the mid 80s, showing up right there. And then it'll continue to kind of cool off as those storms move east, but you'll have plenty of heating with all those storms. Another severe weather component you'll have is plenty of moisture, especially into Oklahoma. You'll have dew points well into the lower 70s. That's going to be definitely a big problem with all those storms. But and then you pretty much have this plume of moisture, dew points into the lower 60s all the way into even parts of South Dakota, into Nebraska there, into western Iowa as well. And you also have dew points into the mid and lower 70s throughout Oklahoma, and then eastern Texas there showing up later this evening into tonight. And still you have that moisture just continuing to surge north. Also looking towards our later storms into the evening, you can definitely see that dry line forming into Texas and Oklahoma, and then into Kansas, and then even into parts of Nebraska. Definitely a fine line between those moist dew points and those drier dew points, with that dry air behind the moisture. Looking at our low-level jets, definitely you have a very strong low-level jet, definitely across eastern Oklahoma, eastern Kansas, and then into eastern Nebraska, western Iowa, western Missouri, western Arkansas later this evening. And this is definitely going to be a problem with all these storms and that squall line that'll move east throughout some of these states right here. And then you definitely have a low-level jet that is capable of helping to produce those tornadoes for sure. Looking at our mixed layer cape, you'll have plenty and just an absolute just a lot of instability across mainly into Kansas and then into Oklahoma. I mean, mixed layer cape values all the way above 4,000 joules per kilogram showing up, and you'll have this very large plume of instability, area I should say, of instability just mainly across Oklahoma, eastern Kansas, even into sometimes southeastern Nebraska, western Missouri, and then into Arkansas as well. And then that'll pretty much be where that squall line is and with those storms. But you'll definitely have to watch those storms that get into Kansas and Oklahoma tonight, not tonight, later this evening into tonight, with all that instability and that low-level jet just pushing all that moisture up too, and it'll definitely help promote tornadoes for sure. Another thing to look for is the 0 to 3 kilometer cape values. Definitely worrying sign into parts of Oklahoma and into Kansas. 0 to 3 kilometer cape values on the 20ZHRRR showing well over 100 joules per kilogram into the almost 150 range there, and then even 200 there. That's probably a little bit overdone, but still you'll have plenty of instability in the 0 to 3 kilometer levels for sure. Looking at our mid-level jet, you're definitely going to have a sufficient mid-level jet to help kind of ventilate those storms and promote that the hail growth in all of these areas here. And I mean, you have a 70 knot mid-level there across eastern Kansas, and then into Oklahoma, 60 knot mid-level jet there. So definitely something to keep watching and monitor, especially with all these storms that'll begin forming and that are currently forming into Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska right now. Now looking at our significant tornado parameter, puts together a bunch of parameters and just looks at the overall tornado potential. I don't always look at this, but it's just a good thing to look at sometimes. But you can just see the signal for those definitely tornadoes into Oklahoma and then into Kansas as we get into the next couple of hours, and then into later this evening. Just a very potent signal showing up over into parts of Oklahoma and then even into far northern Texas there. Now looking at radar quickly, do have several severe thunderstorm warnings across the central US, and we do have one tornado warning, but it has been canceled as of 5:22 p.m. Central Daylight Time. That's going to be it for this evening's update. I know it was very quick, but I just want to get this video out as quickly as I could. But I really appreciate all of y'all watching, and I hope everybody stays safe if you live in any of these areas affected by the severe weather tonight. I hope everyone has a great evening.